welcome to the United States Heartland China Association's The Way Forward webinar. The United States Heartland China Association, or we should call it US Heartland China Association, is a Heartland-based 501c3 nonprofit serving the US Heartland region, as you can see from here. Our mission is to foster and support a positive, productive, and mutually beneficial relationship between the United States and China by creating more channels of collaboration and opportunities for economic growth in the United States Heartland region. The topic today is agricultural transformations in China and its global trade implications. Before we get started, 3 housekeeping items. First of all, throughout the session, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A option. We did receive a lot of questions beforehand. Thank you very much. We will do our best to answer questions. Secondly, after the event, you will receive a very brief survey. We would love to hear from you how we can do better and what topics you care about. Finally, for the USHCA guests, donors, and members who will be joining the invitation-only group discussion after the public program, all you need to do is stay on at the end of the public program, and we'll move you into the group discussion. With that, let me introduce our US Heartland China Association host today, Jim Schultz. Jim Schultz is a founder of Open Prairie and is responsible for the management of 4 private equity funds with investments in innovative technologies spanning agriculture, medical devices, and information systems. Funds invested by Open Prairie have resulted in 2 successful IPOs and created over 4,000 jobs across 25 portfolio investments. Jim's current fund strategy is focused on agribusiness investments in rural America under USDA licensed Rural Business Investment Program. Jim was born in Central Illinois, adjacent to the building which housed his great-great-grandfather's trading post, which supplied wagons heading west on the Cumberland Trail. A 5th-generation Illinoisan, Jim has continued his family legacy in agribusiness throughout the Americas with investments in ag tech, ag input companies, rural businesses, and farmland. In addition to being a successful agribusiness entrepreneur and private equity executive, Jim also served the state of Illinois from 2015 to 2017 as the Director of Department of Commerce in the then newly elected state of Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner's cabinet. So now let me turn to Jim to introduce our speaker today. Jim?
Ben, thank you, and it's great to have all of you join us today. You know, I think this is a timely opportunity to have Dr. Wendong Zhang present his observations on China and China's agricultural policy and agricultural development. On Monday, the Wall Street Journal had an article about increased activities between the US and Chinese officials on completing and committing to carrying out the Phase 1 trade accord. And so I think, you know, there's optimism that will occur. We obviously have an election coming up that could change things going into 2021. So the timing of this presentation with Dr. Zhang is, I think, again, very timely. We're going to do a few things today as far as polling to try to make this a little more interactive. I think as we've all learned to use Zoom or video conferencing, we like to maybe see if we can't make it more about all of us than maybe just a one-dimensional kind of opportunity. So I'm going to ask Min to pull up a poll to just see what people think the percentage of arable land that is in China today. So Min, would you pull up that poll before I introduce Dr. Zhang?
Sure.
So if you would take a minute and answer the question here on the poll, and then we'll give the results and see how close everybody is to what percentage of land in China is arable. All right, man, let's cut it off and give the results, please. Wow, we've got some smart people on the group. So 7% is the right number. So again, thanks for joining in the poll, and we'll learn more from Dr. Zhang. I'll do a quick overview of Dr. Zhang and his background. It's very impressive. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Economics at Iowa State. He's been there since August of 2015. His research seeks to better understand U.S. farmland market, agricultural water conservation, and Chinese agriculture. Dr. Zhang is also affiliated with the Center for Agriculture and Rural Development. Wendong leads the annual Iowa Land Value Survey, and he's a co-founder of the new Iowa State University China Ag Center, jointly with Dr. Demont Hayes, in collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Wendong received his PhD in Agriculture, Environmental, and Development Economics from Ohio State University in July of 2015, and he also received a BS in Environmental Science from Fudan University in China. Please join me in welcoming Wendong Zhang. Wendong?
Thank you very much, Jim and Min. It's my great pleasure to talk with you today about agricultural trade. As Jim talked about, this is really an interesting time and very timely given the new progress on the Phase 1 deal. I have to admit that my daughter is actually having a Zoom meeting for her first grade virtual class as well. So to save bandwidth, I probably in the middle, I may have to shut down my video to help the communication. So today I'm going to talk about the topic is one of the themes is that China has become so big that sometimes some of the agricultural policies that China initiates mainly to deal with domestic issues that now has a lot of global trade implications, including the Chinese ethanol mandates, the reforms on the corn policy, and what is a new recent example would be the African swine fevers and their rebuilding efforts. You can see that China has become one of the major market mover in a global agricultural trade arena. So to move forward, I want to set the stage. When you're looking at what happened over the last quarter or two, that what we have seen a quick deterioration of the bilateral relations that spanning across many arenas from technology to national security to Hong Kong, South China Sea. And what is interesting is that the origin of the tensions of the U.S.-China relations being the start of the trade war in early August, in April 2018, suddenly become one of the stabilization point. There's more desire to keep that going compared to many other places in the many other arenas in the bilateral relations. One of the first observation I want to make is when you are looking at the recent news, even the clues before that, is the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal is still alive, and both sides are very committed to the successful execution about the Phase 1 deal, at least to make good efforts about it. I will provide more details on it, and you can see, especially after China has, the COVID-19 situation in China has become more stabilized, the purchases of agricultural products by China from the US has accelerated, especially over the last 2-3 months. However, we don't want to become too, we also want to point out there are discussions and there are caveats on this because there are a lot of more signals coming out from the current Trump administration talking about what is the value or what is this deal as valuable as it was signed in January as well, right? So here are some data that potentially can give you some more encouraging news about what China has been doing. When you're looking at these two charts created by my colleague, Dr. Ted Hart at ISU, the red line shows you the sales of the 2020. So on the left, it shows you as the advanced soybean sale, which is the sales, the contracts for the crops that is currently in the ground, right? So in comparison with 2018 and 2019, since late May and early June, the Chinese pace because increased purchases from China, this has outpaced, created significant growth over the last months or two, right? And when you're looking at on the right, the pork export phase, the red line is also showing you the 2020 U.S. pork export. A lot of those are driven by the strong demand from China, following the trend as China trying to deal with the damages that caused by African swine fever, which lost about 40% of the hog herd, and now are still at least 20% down. So, so what is the phase one deal? The phase one deal essentially is the China promises as part of the phase one deal, which is the 88-page document. If you haven't really saw it and you're interested in about agriculture, you should take a look and see what's included. That not only includes the purchase target, but also has some interesting element about structural reforms and even what is the definition of the agricultural exports in the phase one deal as well. So for example, infant formula would be counted as the agricultural brackets, and from the phase one deal standpoint, the year 2020 ends in February 14th next year. So it started mid-February this year, so spans until next year, right? So when you are looking at what China promises as one of the key things for agricultural purchases, the blue line here early on, it shows you the actual U.S.-China agricultural trade statistics. In general, you are seeing the, in general, when you are seeing the, there is significant growth after China joined WTO. The high watermark is probably around 25 to 28 billion dollars in late 2010s, and the trade war has significantly impacted the bilateral trade relations. And what the phase one deal promises that China will buy an additional $12.5 billion more compared to the 2017 baseline, and for the 2021 will buy 19.5 more compared to the 2017 baseline. What it means is that China will commit to buy really significant amount that they never bought before, and even outblow the trajectory that if you assume that GDP and per capita income growth will lead to growth in the export and food demand, that number is blown by this promised quantity as well. So that's why when the phase one deal was initially signed, there are a lot of doubts on how realistic these targets are. So especially now in a time of pandemic, this caused some challenges in meeting these targets. So I can show you some statistics that what China has been buying even with the recent progress, right? So when you are thinking about what China has bought, we have developed a sort of a tracker, a more detailed discussion as part of the ISU card policy briefs that will update using the Q2 data later this week and early next. In general, we are finding that China has, for the first half, has bought about $7.27 billion agricultural products. As of July, it's probably still less than 10. So there are significant amount of the growth over the last quarter. However, when you are thinking about the target, which is close to $35 billion, is still well below that. And even if you do extrapolation and thinking about building in some of the momentum recently, that amount is still not significant enough to reach the targets yet, right? So there are still a lot of progress needs to be made. There are some really encouraging signs. One is the one that I talked about for soybeans, that China bought record level of soybeans from Brazil and will likely transition to the US because because there's a seasonality that typically the peak season for US soybean exports would be September to February. So China will soon transition to be a more US dominated purchase strategy. And corn is a bright spot that China has bought record level of corns, and we project that China actually will for the first time in a long time will exceed the tariff rate quota that they have imposed for corn purchases, right? So again, there are some other institution tracking this progress as well, not only for agriculture. One of the notable sources is the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Chad Bown is one of the leading authorities in this arena, that when you are thinking about the Chinese imports by product types, what they did is that they proportionalized the targets and compare with the actual purchases till July compared to what the target would be, right? So the target says China commit to buy about $36 billion in the calendar year of 2020. However, currently till July, they have only bought about $10 billion. It's still a large gap. So China, that's why that in the meeting on Monday, there are a lot of discussions, and right after that, there are more purchases coming from China as well. So there are some encouraging signs, but still there are a lot of hard work needs to be done. I want to point out some of the potential growth area in addition to soybeans later down the road, right? So the
let's Wendong, let's do a quick poll just to maybe get a pulse from what people think of the number of what people believe we'll actually see in purchases from China this year for 2020. Min, would you throw up that next poll and just let's see whether our group thinks of we're going to have a pessimistic outcome, an optimistic one, or we're going to end up somewhere in the 36 billion as Wendong had mentioned. So if you would take a few seconds and click on one of the buttons, and Min, throw that up once we have a sampling. All right, do we have enough results?
I think so. Let's see.
All right, looks like it's more pessimistic than what the 36 billion that was on the previous slide. So we'll see, and then hopefully in the 1st of January we'll have another event like this and reflect back on this poll. So thank you everyone for doing that. Wendong, back to you.
Yep, thank you. And even when we are looking at the polls, that the dominant answer is $25 to $30 billion, which is the highest watermark based on the historical records, right? So I think early on, due to the pandemic, and there are some voices both in the US and in China talking about whether there are possibilities for extension of the calendar year that potentially could cover more times to allow the exports of the 2020 crops. So I think that just remains to be seen. So that's a possibility. When you are thinking about, before I talk about some of the more specific product targets, I want to give you some feel about a survey that we have done, and as from Purdue as well, talking about what is the US farmers and Midwest farmers' attitudes towards the trade war with China. So one of the backdrop of a lot of the discussion nowadays is that when you're looking at the charts on the left, it shows the Pew Research Center polls talking about the percent of US adults who say they have an unfavorable opinion of China. So consistently, regardless of which demographics and which party you're looking at, there are significant increase in the share of people who say they have unfavorable opinions of China, especially sharply over the last 3 years. There are some promise for the youth that in general has more favorable views about China. However, when you're thinking about, at the same time that the Purdue University has Ag Economy Barometer on the right, they ask 2 questions about what are the US agricultural producers' perception about China. The blue bar shows the percent of people who think the trade dispute will likely be settled soon. There are some progress in the Chinese purchases and the news. So there are some, with the pandemic, there's the erosion of the people since the signing of the phase 1 deal, saying that they expect this will be likely to be resolved soon. But a lot of people, over 60% think that trade dispute with China will ultimately be resolved in a way that benefits the US agriculture, right? So that's what my predecessor reminds me, that the US farmers are eternally optimistic. So when you are thinking about some of the specific questions, we have done a survey last year in a sick of the trade war in 2019, asking Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota crop farmers about their views for U.S.-China trade war. At the bottom, you can see that essentially there are over 80% of the people have issues with trade deficits with China, the amount of debt held by China, cyber issues, job loss to China, intellectual property records by protection by China. Despite that, there's overwhelmingly over 90% of the people think it is important for U.S. to maintain a healthy economic relations with China. Although 75% of the people recognize American farmers will bear the brunt of the tariffs imposed by the Chinese government, 56% of the farmers we surveyed are supportive of President Trump's action to impose tariffs on China in 2019, right? So when you are thinking, another thing is that the 80% of the farmers hope this trade disruptions is resolved soon because that they recognize the impacts, financial impacts on the agricultural economy, right? So that's some of the general framework, and that even though that there are a lot of concerns, but I think the farmers recognize the importance of the U.S.-China economic relations, especially for the Midwest region, right? So one of the things I want to talk about is when we are talking about U.S.-China trade, agricultural exports, we typically focus on soybeans only. However, when you are thinking about China's growing appetite, that does not only limited on, it's not only restricted to soybeans. And when you are thinking about what sort of the products likely will be gross, maybe we can pull up another poll, and then you can pull the poll for which products will likely see some growth to see what the audience think. Then I can share some of my personal view on this one. So this talking you can pick an option, or you can pick all of the above for what products you expect to see increase in exports to China. Okay. All right, do we have enough votes?
Sure, enough a sample and end the poll.
Well, this time people are really bullish and optimistic, but a lot of people post protein and corn, and so I'm all of the above, right? So I think I'm in the same camp. When you are thinking about what is the potential growth, one of the fundamentals is when you are thinking about the Chinese economic growth, although it's slowed down from double-digit growth to roughly 5 to 6% probably down the road for the next decade, that still translating to significant growth in per capita income as well as the per capita meat consumption. So on the left, it shows you a chart of the projected per capita meat consumption for China with the dark blue line at the bottom being pork, it shows that the China is still a pork and will remain a pork-dominant country. So as the start of the African swine fever, there are a lot of discussion about whether Chinese people will switch to chickens, for example. I think that probably won't happen in the short run. What I want to point out is that if you pay attention to the orange bar, which is beef, even though that you see a minuscule increase compared year to year over the last 5-6 years, that 1 pound per person gross roughly has caused a significant billion-dollar movements in the global market and benefiting especially Brazilian and Australia agricultural exports. Right. On the right is another thing that that is rising with the 400 million middle class that is growing in China as well. That the Chilean cherries are used as one of the status good. So because this is sort of the conspicuous consumption that you can see from the size, this is the imported good, that some of the more urbanites are buying a lot of those along with avocado as well. So this is in line with my observation when you are thinking about what's the long-term consequences of the phase 1 deal, is that when you look at this chart on the left, you can ignore the distribution of the sources or the countries for now. But when you're looking at on the left, you see all sorts of agricultural products. The soybeans on top, and when you see two colors, you see more. You see a yellow, which means that China is buying from the U.S. So China roughly buys 12 to $15 billion of soybeans from the U.S. However, China buys more from Brazil, which is indicated in the gray bar. I want you to pay attention to, for example, corn. China typically doesn't buy a whole lot of corn at all before, right? So this year they have significantly increased that. I think that I would not solely based on that as a reaction to the phase 1 deal, because that China 2-3 years ago already talked about recognizing corn as a feed and energy crop. There's a lot of encouragement in a number 1 policy document encouraging corn for silage production as well, in line with the domestic ethanol production, right? So when you are thinking about the proteins, beef and pork and poultry, China buys from other countries, but not from the US. Similarly for consumer-oriented retail products, for vegetables, fruits, wine, beer, infant formulas, I think that the US has the possibility of potentially grow these markets, including ethanol as well, that those markets, from China's standpoint, this also means that China potentially has more capabilities in and economic ties and with agricultural communities, not only with the Midwest, but also with the Southeast poultry farmers, and also with the coastline, California and Florida, fruits and vegetable growers. So there are a lot of more, I think these are some of the mutually beneficial growth opportunities, especially as China battling with African swine fever, right? So one of the things I want to talk about is when you're looking at fundamentally in the future, that the commodity agriculture is not the comparative advantage for China. So China will continue to significantly need the US agricultural exports. So I share some of the thoughts on the article below, so you can find the link here. But in general, this map sums some of the key observations. That this is a lower 48 states overlaid with China. You see that one of the observation is when you are looking at this map is you recognize China and the US are both huge countries, right? So however, when you are thinking about that for Iowa as such a north states in compared to such a states in north relative to a lot of the crop production area in many other countries, that Iowa enjoys some of the things that China doesn't necessarily have the advantage, not only because it's premier soils, but also because the U.S. is surrounded three sides by oceans, which provide ample precipitation for Iowa and southern Minnesota to maintain the successful and profitable rain-fed agriculture, right? So my hometown, denoted the star here, is not Beijing, because it's the same latitude with Kansas. So the same, my hometown area in Shandong province has been growing corn and wheat production for almost like more than 1,000 years. However, I will talk with you a little bit more later about some of the transformations in my hometown area that is indicative of the fundamentals shifting in China, right? So although China has roughly the same land area, as showed in our poll, that China doesn't have a whole lot of arable land. When you are thinking about western part of China, the Himalayas, the Tibet region, and a bunch of deserts in the north area, which means that where people live is mainly in the eastern side. Okay, so for those of you who are in the US, I would say that the 90% of the 1.4 billion people live in the cyclone covered area. Right. So when you are thinking about the what it means is that a lot of those people will be competing land for urbanization, for agricultural production, for livestock, which is the pork production will be in the south, the corn is in the north. My hometown area in the middle would be the wheat country, and my wife is coming from Jiangxi province, which is in a rice country, right? So when it comes to the ratios, China has roughly 20% of the world population, only 79% of the arable land, while the US has less than 4% of the population, close to 15% of arable land, right? That alone is a 6-time difference. And so that's why that China will be still in a significant need for global markets when it comes to especially land-intensive feed grains and land-intensive proteins such as soybean, sorghum, and beef, for example, right? So here is some of the things that I talked about, that my hometown area used to be a wheat country, but however, now this is the scene of on the left is this production scene in my hometown area. This is my uncle holding his grandson in a vegetable greenhouse garden a couple years ago. So the transformation, again, is, for those of you who are familiar with the Chinese market, is that my hometown area is about 5 hours south of Beijing and Tianjin. So they are supplying, they're growing these vegetables, not going to the local farmers market, but to go to the supermarkets in Beijing and Tianjin, but also that's cucumbers and tomatoes, and there are honeydews and melons that goes to South Korea and Japan for exports as well. So so those are some of the transformations, because that the income for those type of production, because of the lack of land around the mega cities to supply those fresh produce, have given opportunities for the transformation in my hometown area. During the pandemic, this is also my hometown's, essentially the county official going on the mobile platform promoting the vegetables in my home counties, because nowadays more than 500 million customers shop on mobile phones, and this has become one of the standard way doing business and promoting the agricultural produce. Right? I want to echo that as we are talking about doing this webinar earlier, about 2 weeks ago, that so when you are thinking about on the left is the in Iowa and the Midwest and US Heartland region has experienced significant storms that it's never seen before, called derecho. This is one of the scenes from Iowa. Even in my neighborhood, there are multiple trees down. Even on the right, it shows there are floods going on in my hometown area, flooding the vegetable greenhouses. So I hope that both regions will recover from these natural disasters and become stronger afterwards, right? So with the remainder of the time, I want to follow up and briefly talk about some of the things that especially why U.S. will need China when looking ahead. So one of the things is that what has caused a lot of the significant discussion earlier this year in China is that the Premier of China, Li Keqiang, talked about that China has over 600 million people who have a monthly disposable income that is less than 140 US dollars, right? So that's 1,000 RMBs, which shocked a lot of people inside China as well, because that when you are looking at the news, that you are always talking about, a lot of the attentions are devoted to the urban cities and the newer middle class and the Chilean cherries, but those are some of the sobering statistics, which also, when you are thinking about where things are, one of the more lucky things for the U.S. is when you are thinking about a lot of the major agricultural universities, they are in the Heartland region. They are very integrated into the production scene. So I have formal extension appointment to help Iowa farmers in a way, but when you are thinking about the Chinese distribution, some of the best universities are actually in the cities, right? So it's a very different system. So that's what I talked about, which also means that when you have 600 million people who are still earning less than $140 per month, this shows a lot of significant growth potential. That's why the Brookings Institute talked about when projecting where the next billion middle class would be, 88% would be in Asia, and China and India would be one of the two of the major markets, right? From the agricultural standpoint, India and to some extent Indonesia has some limitations because of religious beliefs. So some of the meat exports will be harder to crack compared to China, right? So another thing I want to remind you is that China is a country of really rapid change. I still remember when I went to Fudan University in Shanghai from my state capital, from the state capital, Jinan, in 2005 when I started college. It took about 11 hours without the high-speed rail. The same route now, less than a decade later, in 2016, the last time I was back, is less than 4 hours, right? So that's one of the things that China is growing, that shows you why from the U.S. agricultural export standpoint, these per capita meat consumption, as well as the demand for foods from overseas, will continue to be there. Will China continue to be a really significant market and customer for the U.S. agriculture, right? So I want to also share that when you are thinking about the Chinese agricultural markets and agricultural policies, increasingly they look like U.S. and the European markets. So when you are thinking about the African swine fever, right? So on the left, on the right, it shows you the significant decline, 40% decline in hog herds due to the African swine fever since August 2018. There are significant rebuilding efforts. Now it's still about 20% down. So China's target is by end of this year, or I think more realistically by end of next year, be going back to probably the pre-African swine fever level. And before the African swine fever, 97% of the pork China can produce domestically. I think the target is still over 95%, so I don't think that China will significantly suddenly become over-reliant in terms of pork imports from other countries, right? So I have talked about the pork exports before. So another thing is when you are thinking about some of the recent reforms in China, one of the corn policy ending the high support policies that it has been in place for a while to a more acre subsidy for the producers, because that when you are thinking about back in 2007 and 2017, 2013, China has implemented the temporary reserve program for corn and wheat. So when the U.S. corn prices that dropped from $7 per bushel to about $3 and $4, China is still promising about $9 per bushel for farmers to go to purchase by the government, and a lot of those go to state reserved, grain reserved, not necessarily used by the livestock producers, which led to significant price gaps between the imported prices and the domestic prices, and led to significant imports of the corn and substitutes throughout these years in order to make up the gaps on the right. So at the ISU China Ag Center that Min mentioned, we also have a bunch of other articles that talk about various issues in China, including the rural land policy reform. We are also currently updating, writing an article about an update on the East 10 ethanol mandate, some other issues related to how you thinking about the fundamental comparative advantage from the US Midwest view. So I encourage you to check things out. The last point I want to make is, unfortunately, even with the phase 1 deal, China will continue and probably has now a political incentive to accelerate the diversification away from the US despite the trade deal, because from China's standpoint, the US probably is the only country that holds too many cards that the trade can suddenly become an issue that is mingled with a lot of other discussions, from geopolitics to technology to domestic subsidies in China. So one of the major reforms that the President Xi Jinping in China have initiated is called the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you haven't checked this out, I encourage you to take a look. So those are, you can think of this as sort of a 21st century Silk Road along the same route, but it's typically in railways. One of the consequences is that for European pork to go to China, used to be going south of Africa and going to a tanker and take about 2 months. Now through the rail line, it takes about 3 weeks, right? So there are some fundamental changes in transportation costs and the connection between the suppliers and the competitors of the US agriculture with the Chinese buyers. And that probably will continue as well. Another thing that China has significantly increased in investment is Brazil. So China's soybean imports from Brazil has reached a record level in June, in part because of depreciation of the Brazilian currency. But this caused a lot of worries from the for the US agricultural community, right? So for sake of time, I won't explain those charts, but these on the left essentially shows you the percent of the for all the products that China buys from the world, the share that is coming from the U.S. Showing in the orange bar, it has been significantly declining even before the trade war. So that's why that there are continuation, I think, in terms of the strategic diversification away from the U.S., especially for the soybean markets. So in the end, I want to end with a couple of resources. I want to call to your attention on a Financial Times article that Harari wrote, especially talking about in a time of crisis with faith, one of the particularly important choices would be the choice between nationalist isolation and global solidarity. I think that from the U.S. agricultural export standpoint, U.S. has been one of the low-cost, stable, and large quantity supplier, and the stable trade relations with partners, including China, would be beneficial for the U.S. Heartland region and the agricultural production. In the end, for the American audience, I wanted to introduce to you some of the Chinese lessons. On the left, it shows you some of the basic terms that highlights the conflicting and coexisting attitudes of the Chinese public that has towards the U.S. One is the name of the country in China, name of the country U.S. in China, 美国, which literally translated into a beautiful country. It underlines the fundamental tones of the positive attitude in general the Chinese public towards the U.S. as evidenced by there are 350,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S. universities. However, that at the bottom it shows you the 中华民族伟大复兴, which is a grand rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's a goal or branded as a Chinese dream and shared by the Chinese public and the Chinese government. And to help you understand this Chinese political jargon, I will borrow one of the US political jargons, roughly mean make China great again, right? So this shows you, I don't think that this necessarily means that China want to overtake the US as a superpower, but as China want to have a bigger role in the global stage, right? On the right, it shows you the last Chinese phrase I want to share is 危机, which is crisis, which consists of two characters. The first one is 危 means danger, and on the right it means opportunity. So hopefully through this crisis and the pandemic, we can come out and reap these opportunities and see hope and in the mutually beneficial way in the U.S.-China agricultural trade. I have some recommendations on books for you to potentially learn more about the contemporary Chinese economy. This is what I recommended this spring to my students, undergraduate students in my Chinese economy class as well. And I also have some resources potentially for you to learn more about especially the food and agricultural news. So with that, I will close and happy to answer any questions.
Wendong, thank you. That was exceptional. We've had a lot of positive comments in the chat room as well, and people are very appreciative of the information you've shared with us. We had many questions submitted before the event, and I'm going to get to some of those along with a few that have been put into the Q&A box, and please continue to add to those. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A box was with the coming election in some 70 or so days, how is that influencing positive or negative to either candidate from your perspective, or does China not see that as part of the role of trade policy to be looking at how they can influence an election?
On one hand, I do think that the presidential election changed trade policy, right? So Mr. Biden is talking about potentially ending tariffs, but I think that more importantly, China has recognized, unfortunately, there's a general shift in the business and political leadership in the U.S. in terms of general approach dealing with China. So I think I don't think there's any necessarily hopes from the Chinese standpoint, hoping for a drastic change due to the political leadership change in the U.S. So many people in China are expecting probably a bumpy relationship bilaterally, but hopefully trade and agricultural trade is one of the stabling forces among this in this relationship.
Good. One of the questions submitted was about how the U.S. can help contribute to China's ag transformation and how our universities can be involved and play a role in some of the changes going on, particularly with some of the ag tech investment that's happening in both countries, perhaps more so here, but nevertheless, how do we play a role in being good partners?
I think there are a couple ways that we have talked about before, that I think one of the unique features of the U.S. land-grant university is that there's a strong connection between the agricultural communities, both professional and producers, with the academic researchers. I think there are a lot of things that China probably could benefit from the U.S. In that way. And another thing is, when you're thinking about the Chinese, a lot of the new policies that are rolled out in terms of experiments on revenue-based crop insurance and livestock futures. So the U.S. has a lot of experience in those. On the other hand, during the pandemic, especially more the prevalence of the mobile phones in China, the Chinese agricultural community has been doing more promotions through a non-traditional platform, especially from mobile phones and live broadcast. I think that's some of the lessons for the U.S. counterparts as well.
Good. One of the questions that just came in is from my friend Michael Doherty about previous webinars. You've talked about optimism of 16 billion of soybean purchases in 2020 and 2021. Do you still feel optimistic about this level of purchase?
I think so, especially now with the a significant driver is the rebuilding and rising demand from the hog herd. That you see from the corn exports, from the soybean imports as well. However, I do think that in the long run, we may not see the U.S. soybean exports remain at a really significant high level as we've seen before. So before the trade war, China essentially bought about 60% of all U.S. soybean exports. So whether we will continue to see that number remain 60%, I think that from China's standpoint, the Chinese government view that China was taken hostage on the soybean market, so they will have a lot of strategic incentive to diversify and look at what is the sort of the ratios that goes into the Chinese demand. So that's why that you are seeing domestic acreage for soybeans are rising as well.
Good, thank you. One of the questions is about where the future trading partners will come from for China. And Min, would you put up the poll, the fourth poll we have on future trade partners? And then I'll ask, while that poll is up, Matt Creelan's asked the question, but throw that poll up if you would, Min, on what it looks like 5 years from now as far as the trade partners for China. If you would answer this quickly, and while you're answering that, the question from Matt Wendong was, will China be importing more agri-products overall under the deal, or is the share shift away from other producers like Brazil toward the U.S.? So in other words, is Brazil going to become more dominant in relations with China or perhaps other countries? And what's kind of your view? But before you answer that, Min, throw the answer up on the poll, and we'll see if that matches with what Wendong's going to say. Yep. So Brazil comes out ahead, it looks like, on our poll, and yep, at least by 55%. So Wendong, other perspective?
Yeah, I think so far that China has already bought. China bought $80 billion of products in the first half of this year, compared to so it's a 30% growth compared to 2017. I do think their overall demand is rising, but I agree that Brazil will capture a significant share for that, especially. Sorry, I will close the door of the kids.
Okay.
You're thinking about what is growing for for Brazil. There are a lot of positive news. One is the soybean exports is going significantly strong, and now Brazil has corn as a second crop is growing significantly, and they are due to the deterioration of the China and Australia relations. The Brazilian beef is rising compared to other countries as well. So I do share the similar view that at least in the short run, Brazil will be significantly important. But I think that we should broaden our view in terms of what we could do business with China. Not only looking at the feed grains such as soybeans, but thinking about what are sort of other markets.
Good. There's a question from Michael Anderson that he asked, much of the phase one deal discussion and press reports focus on ag purchase commitments, yet the USTR reports that over 50 of the 57 structural reform commitments have been met by China. Would you agree this seems to be underappreciated aspect of the deal in the press and in public discourse, and why or why not?
I agree. So, but there's another underlying reasons why the USTR cannot really discuss a whole lot about the purchase target, because there's no quarterly goals. This is the overall goal for the year. So there's no specification for China when China necessarily buys, right? So you cannot necessarily say that China didn't meet the target mid of the year because the goal is the year end. But I do think that there are some structural changes. But I think when the phase one deal is rolled out, many people. One of the reasons that people are talking about the objective is this is a little unconventional to have those bilateral purchase targets, because the trade negotiations typically about removal tariff and non-tariff barriers. So that's why when you're looking at the chat-bound article I shared, there are criticism talking about whether this is moving from a rule-based discussion to a managed trade negotiation. So there are some philosophical discussions. From the news standpoint, the headlines tend to grab on the purchases, right? So those are the USDA release weekly sales reports, so you can give signals on whether China is on track. So there are some reasons there as well.
Good. One of the questions we have is about the fact that the U.S. does have some competitive advantage, particularly as you move away from commodity type products. And are there any particular U.S. agricultural products that you think have more quantifiable advantages over other countries? For example, the U.S. has U.S. bred pigs that have more back fat, as an example. Are there other examples that you can point to, or things that you see that we can make a more competitive opportunity for U.S. farmers and producers?
So I think there are some growth opportunities. There are some, so the specialty nuts, for example, in the coast area, some of the fruits are grown, and some of the dairy products the U.S. have. Although the dairy products maybe come in different formats, right? So I think there are a lot of potential, and there's also an urgency that, for example, if the U.S. beef doesn't get to the Chinese market quickly, then the urbanites customers could develop taste for the grass-fed beef, then could affect the prospects of the future U.S. beef exports.
Excellent. I'm going to ask one last question, if I could, Min, one last question from. It's what is the meaning of the recent anti-waste food campaign, and is there actually some kind of food supply problem in China today?
I don't think so. So I also saw a lot of the discussions on food security. I think during the pandemic, people are anxious about the income prospects. So one of the things that we have really nice statistics in the U.S. about the unemployment and the displacement cost, that in China you don't necessarily see a lot of those accurate statistics that adds to the anxiety of a lot of the people, right? So when you have those discussions, and people worry about whether China has become too reliant on the global market, right? So many of the people don't necessarily know that the soybean imported from the U.S. are not directly consumed by people, right? So those are the food crops. So there are some misconceptions So I don't necessarily think there is a fundamental supply or shortage issue going on, but it reflects the anxiety and attitudes among the public.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that wraps up our program. We're a little bit past. Thank you for those that participated. This program has been recorded, so it will be made available publicly. This concludes our public part of the presentation. We do have a private meeting after this with Dr. Zhang and a few of our donors and advisors. For those that have been invited, please stay on this Zoom call. The others will ask you to drop off. I'll hand it back to Ning.